Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. There has been a spate of coups in Africa over the last 18 months. Most of these coups have taken place in West Africa, but not all. This includes Burkina Faso, Guinea, Chad, Sudan, and 2 coups in Mali. And this is not to mention some attempted coups, most recently in Guinea Bissau. On the line with me to discuss why there have been so many coups recently and whether or not this is a trend is Solomon Dersso. He is the founder of Amani Africa, an Adis Ababa-based think tank with a focus on the African Union and African Union affairs. We kick off discussing whether or not there is a contagion of coups in Africa in general and West Africa in particular. We then have an in-depth conversation about the similarities between many of these recent coups and what more regional bodies like the African Union and the Economic Community of West African States can do to prevent or deter the military overthrow of civilian rule. And today's episode was recorded live on Twitter, and it is produced in part through the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York through a grant to showcase and highlight African expertise on peace and security issues in Africa. Thanks as always for tuning in to the show. Please do be sure to subscribe to the full feed of the podcast to access our entire archive of conversations stretching back to 2013. I think you'll find many of them useful. All right, now here is my conversation with Solomon Dersso, founder of Amani Africa.
In order to speak of a trend, I think it's important to have a baseline from which you start. And if you look at the trend in Africa, particularly since the turn of the century with the establishment of the African Union, we have witnessed a marked decline in the pace of occurrence of coups in Africa. Within a year, you may have a maximum of 2 successful coups happening in the course of this period. And there are a number of years during which coups didn't happen at all. Now, in a matter of about 9 months, we have witnessed the occurrence of at least 4 successful coups in less than a year. And this is the single highest number of incidents of coups. This is without counting, of course, incidents of attempted coups.
And you're saying the advent of the African Union in, 2002? In the years following that, up until very recently, you've seen a marked decline in the number of coups and sort of if not a democratic consolidation, at least a degree of political stability in many countries throughout Africa.
Yes, that's right. So a number of factors played into this. One is relative consolidation of the democratization process on the continent, with some of the positive economic developments that have also been registered in various parts of the continent, as well as, importantly, some of the very successful normative and institutional changes that were undertaken at the level of the African Union and regional bodies like the Economic Community of West African States, for example, where we have witnessed the adoption of anti-coup norms by these organizations, to which they have attached a specific sanctions regime. And these contributed heavily to this decline in coups. So much so that we have witnessed in some cases, militaries going extra mile, as we have witnessed, for example, in Zimbabwe, to avoid being considered as engaging in coups.
Interesting. So, given all that, why do you think now, at least over the last several months, there have been so many coups in such a short period of time after a period of sort of relatively, few coups?
Yeah. So this we can approach from two perspectives. The first perspective is that of trends or explanations that apply to all cases. I think there are certain trends or explanations that apply to all cases.
And what are some of those?
Now, let me mention some of these. One is we have witnessed a notable regression in the democratization process on the continent. This has been registered in the various democracy evaluating databases, whether it is Freedom House or the Mo Ibrahim Index. And this has been manifested in terms of the increasing lack of support to government on the part of the public, issues relating to lack of faith and confidence on the part of the public about elections and the outcome of elections, thereby the legitimacy of governments have increasingly become suspect in many parts of the continent. The extension of term limits by presidents who have been in power for many years, they are taking advantage of their incumbency in order to stay longer than their constitutional welcome by tampering with provisions in constitutions, as happened, for example, in Guinea.
We call this
interesting to see also,
right? Constitutionally dubious attempts to ensconce yourself in a third term when previously the Constitution only permitted 2 terms, and that is certainly a trend we've seen.
Exactly, and you also have many of the socioeconomic fallouts from COVID, also adding further pressure on state-society relationship, particularly in a context in which the living standard of people have gone down, with millions of people reported to have been pushed into extreme poverty.
Well, can I stop you there? Because that was actually one of my very specific questions for you. To what extent is the exogenous shock of COVID a factor in the fact that there have been so many coups? I mean, you describe a scene in many countries in which there is a deficit of legitimacy by the government,
yep.
And then layered on top of this is COVID.
So COVID is a factor to the extent that it actually shapes the political context and landscape of the countries in which these coups are happening. It's not unique to these countries. It is something that is shared among many other countries. But we are talking about generally the various sources of pressure in state-society relationship, which actually created the conditions that made it possible for the military basically to use their possession of the gun in order to direct it at the government of the day, against whom there is a lot of disenchantment on the part of the public. And there are, of course, I think importantly, Mark, what I call specific explanations unique to or particular to each case. Mm-hmm. If you go to Guinea, it's important to remember that the extension of the term limit of the incumbent, the now overthrown President Condé, it was hugely unpopular and highly contested, forced on the public. It triggered a lot of protest from the public, and yet it went ahead. Other institutions that are supposed to prevent this from happening, such as the judiciary or parliament, they do not have the independence and the tradition of exercising control and accountability over the executive. The executive apparently have what in some parts of the continent are considered to be imperial power. Then you also have the election happened in 2020, and apparently he won the election. Again, raising serious question about whether or not elections actually tell us a story about the health of democracy of countries. And if anything that Guinea's story tells us, elections do not tell us anything about the health of democracy of countries. And Guinea is not the only country in respect of which we are saying this. Elections have become just, a process that incumbents have mastered to manipulate to their advantage, leading to the disenfranchisement of many on the continent. Then if you move on to Burkina Faso, it has to do with weak state institutions that have become under pressure from ever expanding terrorist attacks, from which the military themselves have become major casualties. And there is, therefore, as a result, a pressure emerged from that, whereby the military is saying the government of the day is not providing the necessary leadership and support that is required in order for them to be in a position to fight back. And added to that layer, or is of course, some additional factors, such as, for example, disputes over, the kind of support, international support that the country needs to seek in order to capacitate the military to fight back the ever-expanding terrorist attack, which have resulted in the geographic spread and rise in frequency of attacks, and also the exacerbation of the humanitarian situation, with over 2 million people having been displaced. In Mali, you have a different context. It was a combination of the military feeling that the government is failing with respect to the effort to counterattack the terrorist groups in Mali, together with bad electoral outcome, bad electoral management, or electoral disputes, in which parliamentary election was resulted in a situation where the vast majority of the public felt that it was stolen by the party in power, leading to a widespread popular protest in the country. It was in the context of that wide popular protest that the military actually intervened and removed the government. Of course, it repeated itself later on.
Yeah, sorry, go right ahead. You can finish your thought.
I think the other factor is problems relating to the security sector and the relationship in between the military and the civilian authorities.
That's actually exactly what I wanted to ask you next. I mean, each of these coups happen in their own unique context, but one similarity, and I would not be the first to point this out, is that many of the coup leaders in the places you just described are relatively younger officers, often with like special forces or some sort of like unique training. What similarities do you see among these coup leaders, both in terms of their individual profile and their relationship with the civilian leadership that they overthrew?
So one of the things that you see is basically these are officers that have been trained. Actually, the three colonels were in the same exercise, joint exercise that was undertaken in Burkina Faso by the U.S. military. There is, therefore, in part, what you may consider to be a neighborhood, influenced, or what you may consider to be a contagion of sorts happening in other results. These are people who have went through the same exercise, have had maintained links, and also they have been engaged also in trained for other special forces for purpose of certain activities in Burkina Faso and Mali, for example. They were actively involved in the fight against the terrorist groups. So these are the kinds of profiles that you see, and indeed the training that they have received, such as, for example, from the security and training partnership with the US, for example. These are some of the patterns that you identify from them. And of course, what this also suggests is basically that these people exposed to certain ideals, exposed to certain ways of expectations of their own and people around them, going back to their base and finding all kinds of gaps and weaknesses that doesn't meet their expectation, obviously may look into ways of taking matters into their own hands with the supposed expectation of fixing things, so to speak. Although there is no background or basis to suggest that military coups have led to a better outcome from the experience so far.
So many of these coups, most of these coups, have occurred in West Africa among countries that are members of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS. And it seems there is something of a playbook that ECOWAS invokes when there is a military coup amongst their members. Can you just kind of describe what that playbook is and how it has been manifested and used over these last few months as governments that were members of ECOWAS became prey to coups?
So ECOWAS has a protocol on democracy and governance. And one of the important provisions of this protocol is the banning of unconstitutional changes of government, such as, for example, coming to power through military coup. The result of that banning is basically an automatic outcome. There is an automatic requirement, which is to suspend the country where the military came to power through coup. It is automatic. It's a legal requirement. And it's not the first time, by the way, that ECOWAS deployed this tool in West Africa. Previously, as far back as, for example, in the same country, like, for example, Mali, in 2012, it used this same instrument of suspending the country from active participation in ECOWAS, thereby imposing diplomatic isolation. Adding to that, when measures are not taken by the de facto authorities to return to constitutional order, it adds further sanctions, as it did on Mali, for example, including closure of borders, monetary sanctions, and so on and so forth. This is a well-established way of responding to coups, not just on the part of ECOWAS, but also the African Union at the continental level, shared with others like perhaps most notably the Southern Africa Development Community. So that is the state of the quote-unquote playbook, if you like, to use your term, for responding to coups. I think the question now is whether or not this is really working.
That was my next question. Exactly. Yeah. Is, it seems that, it's not an effective deterrent at this point, especially among ECOWAS countries. So I guess, why is this not working? And what more could regional groups like ECOWAS or even the African Union do to dissuade coups?
So One factor has to do with the fact that these coups largely targeted governments that are regarded by the public as illegitimate, as failing to deliver on their mandate, are not responsive and representative of the wish and will of the public. Some of them accused of corruption in a context where many people are struggling to meet ends. So that is one factor why you have the public not campaigning against those who have seized power through military coup. All right. Then it's also important to note the context, the other precipitating factors, whether it has to do with the fact that there are immediate pressures, such as, for example, the counter-terrorism measures that need to be taken. All right. Now, it is in this context, and also in a context in which, those who are taking power through military means are reaching a point where they are saying the negative consequences of, rejection by the AU and ECOWAS is less important than what they're able to do by taking power through military coup. And it has to do with a number of factors. One, these measures by ECOWAS and the African Union are very reactive. They are basically measures taken after the fact. And there are legitimate concerns being expressed that the African Union and ECOWAS should have been proactive in facilitating measures that prevent the occurrence of coups in the first place. And these measures range from rejecting, for example, extension of term limits by presidents, as happened in Guinea, for example, or by facilitating institutional reform measures that enhance, for example, separation of powers and checks and balances, independence of the judiciary. That deals with corruption, that actually limits resources that could have gone to supporting the security establishment in their fight against terrorism. These are the range of issues, including economic pressure, with respect of which steps needed to be taken, failing which you have these conditions. After the fact, you react. And of course, people are like, but where were you when the situation was festering?
So, to the extent that this might be a contagion of coups, if not in ECOWAS, among other countries in Africa more broadly, is there a next country or a couple of countries that you are most concerned may be next, sort of like the next domino to fall, so to speak?
I think it's difficult to. I don't have a crystal ball to say that this is going to be the next country, but countries having similar features with Burkina Faso and Mali, countries that are under pressure from terrorism, with fragile institutions, and lacking public legitimacy. That is the kind of characteristic that you can look at. But I think it is not possible to say that these are the only contexts in which it happens. Transitional situations may also trigger or create the context for the army to take advantage of transitional contestations into its own hands to orchestrate a coup, whether that is because of mass protest or because of contestation among different political actors. But it's important to note some of the recent attempts that we have witnessed actually in the course of the past week. One in Guinea Bissau, where there was a scare, which actually it was called an attempted coup against the president in Guinea Bissau. And over the course of this week, we also heard some developments that were associated with plans for orchestrating a coup in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And you have, therefore, a situation in which various political contestations being used either by political opponents who, working in concert with the military, try to take out the government of the day, or militaries that are under pressure from terrorism or other pressures basically turn their guns on their own government out of frustration, or militaries who would like to protect their interest, taking advantage of the resentment of the public towards government, basically take power in order to shield themselves, as happened in Sudan.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Solomon. That was very helpful. And just a quick disclaimer that the opinions and views expressed in this conversation belong solely to those of us who expressed them. And lastly, please do reach out to me if you have suggestions of people I should interview or topics I should cover. It's easy to contact me. You can use the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com or through my Twitter profile at Mark L. Goldberg. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.